For ease of painting, I'm going to remove the secondary RA worm wheel here. This is controlled by a clutch, so you can just lift it off the RA wheel. And it's one of the really cool things of both the 5-inch and the 6-inch Unitrons and Polarexes. So with the 4 inches, there isn't this secondary worm wheel up here. The 4 inches, all the RA motion is generated by a worm that's on the equatorial mount itself. Here, there's this secondary worm, and this is really nice because it allows you to move the declination axis in RA separate to the worm. So if you want to slew really quickly, all you have to do is just disengage this with the clutch. I'll come up, it'll disengage from the worm wheel, and you'll be able to slew the scope and point it to wherever you want. I love this feature. So I'm going to take it off now. I take it back to Brisbane with me because I want to have a really close look at some of those the grooves in the worm. So I'm a little bit worried about a couple of patches in there. They might need a little bit of a smooth out, a little bit of a lap, and give it a nice polish so it looks all gleamy and new again. I've taken the end off the cam, and I was just working through, and suddenly I thought, this is under tension, isn't it? I better be a bit careful. And sure enough, there are a couple of springs, I suspect, housed in here to keep pressure on that bar up there. So what I've done is I've put a block of wood underneath the worm wheel so that I can just make sure it doesn't suddenly flip and send bits everywhere. And let's see how this goes. To get access to those two screws, in the end I had to take out both the cam section and the axle to the worm drive as well. It actually wasn't too difficult. There is a keeper on the bolt holding the worm drive in place. Everything came out pretty smoothly in the end. You can see there's been a massive build-up of filth over the years here, and I think that it's going to really benefit from a clean and a degrease. That'll probably be a bit smoother. As I move it by hand, again we got the good old Unitron varnish thing happening, so that'll be much smoother by the time I've finished it. I'll also have a chance to replate some of these fittings as well, so they look a bit nicer. A lot harder than I thought that was going to be. I thought I'd just remove the bolt here and here, the thing would come off, but there we go. Of course, I still haven't got it off. The bolts, those screws are moving though, so I think it'll come off fairly easily. Back in Brisbane again. I've got the reassembled clutch assembly here. I thought I'd go through the disassembly again for those people who have a 5 or 6 inch scope, just so that they, there's a little guide to how to take this off. So to recap, the problem is that there are 4 fixing points for this. There's 2 bolts on the exterior of the assembly, but there are also 2 internal screws here and here, and this cam bar occludes them. So does the worm drive itself. So in order to remove this from the scope, you actually have to take the worm off, and you have to take the cam bar off as well. So the way that I would do this is to leave the 2 bolts in place, take the cam bar off, and take the worm wheel assembly off as well, so that you could access the screws, unscrew those, then take off the bolts as well. First thing you need to do is to take off the screw on the ends of the cam bar. Once you do this, you can take off this little lever. It's a little bit tight, require a little bit of wiggling. There we go. There's a cosmetic little cylinder on top of it as well, that will come off as well. And with the cam bar, if you rotate it so the cutouts are at 90 degrees to the levers at the bottom, you'll find that with a little bit of twisting, and effort, you can get that cam bar out. He says a little bit of A little bit of effort required. So previously I was a little bit concerned about this thing suddenly jumping to bits under the pressure of these two keeper springs here. In point of fact, the amount of travel that bar can make is actually not that great. And so it'll click a bit when you take the cam bar out, but as long as you keep your fingers away from anything that's likely to snap on them, you'll be fine. There we go. Okay, so next thing to do is to remove this axle where the worm assembly rotates. There is a keeper screw on this nut. I've just loosened it off. So this is a little bit stiff. You will need to give it a bit of persuasion. Use a bit of effort and it'll come. Oh, it is stiff. There we go, that's got it. Okay, now you can separate the worm from the cam assembly. Sorry, from the carrier, not the cam assembly. And that gives you access to those two screws there. As I said, the way to do this, if you're taking the assembly off the scope, is to leave the two bolts in place, take the wheel off, take the cam off, take the axle off, take the wheel off, and then you will get access to those two screws. Otherwise, there's just no way, even with a really short screwdriver, that you'll be able to reach in and unscrew them. So the worm is actually in better condition than I thought. I was thinking I was going to have to do a little bit of lapping on it, but it looks good. It is absolutely covered and encrusted in filth, but that's okay. It also suffers from the good old Unitron varnish, as I mentioned earlier on. So I'm going to give this a clean up. I'm going to replate these guys. I'm going to see how badly ingrained some of this stuff is, and I think this will be, the chrome one here is in pretty good nick, and so will be good for that. I don't know whether this is all going to come off. Some of this is pitting, some of it is just dried on grease. We'll see how we go with it. We're looking at the cam from the clutch assembly now. Interestingly, on this side of the cam, that little raised area where there's a detachable cylinder on this side, this is actually a solid piece of metal which is part of the cam itself. So I'm going to leave this in position. It's got relatively little damage on it. This little decorative cylinder on the other side was really badly brassed, so I've taken this off and I've polished it up. So I'm going to plate this rather than doing the silvering that I did with the clock dial. So with the clock drive dial, I was careful to leave quite a bit of grain on that, because with silver or silvering, it's a slightly different process. You're substituting silver for the brass on the surface of the metal. Here I'm actually going to plate nickel onto this, and so instead of having any visible grain, I want to have it absolutely smooth. So I've polished it down to with smaller and smaller grades of wet and dry down to 2000, and then given it a really good go over with some Brasso. I'm going to give it a very good clean now, pickle it in some acid, and then plate it up, and we'll see if we can't get it looking something close to this other section here. That plated up very nicely. It's not an exact match for the previous nickel coating. I think I probably polished it a little bit too much, but I think it makes on this side it's pretty good. It's much better than the brass and the corrosion that there was there beforehand, and also it's going to protect the part. So I think that's kind of nice. I guess I can put the whole thing back together again now. I've tried really hard to just look past this bit of corrosion on these two keepers here, but in true Unitron Polarex fashion, I can't get away from the fact that it's going to be just sitting there, even though I've turned them round so that the worst of the corrosion is hitting. So I'm going to take these off and give them a bit of a replate. I think that Taking them off shouldn't be too much trouble. They're sprung loaded. Putting them back on again might be a different story. I cleaned up the two spring guides and I just plated one, and I had to kind of pinch myself a bit because I've never been able to plate this bright finish before. It is what's bright nickel, but normally I have to do quite a bit of polishing to get a nice finish. This looks almost like chrome straight off the bat. I just compare it to the one pre-plating where I've polished it up. It's gone on really evenly and beautifully. I have no idea what I've done differently, but it's just done a really nice job. I think this is a really good sign. Hopefully the second one will go on as well as the first. We'll see. Everything's back together again now. Both of the guides plated up really well. As I said, I have no idea what I'd do differently, but it looks very close to chrome on those guides. I'm very happy with that. The main thing is that it provides a bit of protection to prevent further corrosion. The other important thing is that we've got this accessory worm spinning nicely as well. So cosmetically and functionally, it's all up together again. So I was really excited about that last bit of plating because I think this is probably the last plating that I'm going to need to do on the scope. And so the fact that it went so well, I think is kind of like, I'm going to take that as a good omen. And so back to the cabin tomorrow, and I'll put it back on the deck axis once I've finished plating that. And that actually will be the last thing that needs to be done on the scope. Everything else is functional now. And so once the paint is hardened off on the deck axis and the RA axis, we shall have first light. I might just manage to get a few pictures of a late stage Mars and maybe an early evening Jupiter before it goes behind the trees. We'll see.